She hadn't cried at the funeral. She hadn't cried when they handed her the folded flag. She hadn't cried in 6 years. Not once. Because crying meant accepting that Daniel was really gone, and some part of her still refused to believe it. Then she saw the dog tags. His dog tags. Around the neck of a stranger she'd never met, at a charity gala she almost didn't attend, and in that single frozen second, every wall she'd spent 6 years building came crashing down. If you've ever lost someone and never got to say goodbye, this story is for you. Watch until the very end, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The Whitmore Legacy Gala was, by every reasonable measure, the kind of event that made ordinary people feel invisible. Not because anyone was deliberately cruel about it. No one walked around sneering at the uninvited. It was subtler than that, the kind of invisibility that came from sheer concentrated wealth. The way a room full of private jets and penthouse addresses simply generated its own gravitational pull, and everything outside that orbit just ceased to exist. The ballroom of the Harrington Grand Hotel occupied the entire 42nd floor, and tonight it had been transformed into something that looked less like a charity event and more like a movie set designed by someone with an unlimited budget and a deep personal grudge against restraint. Crystal chandeliers hung at staggered heights across the ceiling, throwing fractured light across tables draped in ivory linen. Centerpieces built from white orchids and brushed gold candelabras stood 3 feet tall. The auction items displayed along the western wall included a private island experience, a seat on a commercial spaceflight, and what the printed program described simply as an afternoon with a sitting U.S. senator, which was either impressive or unsettling depending on your politics. 800 guests filled the room, CEOs, retired generals, federal judges, a former vice president who still traveled with a 6-person security detail even though nobody had tried to assassinate him in years. 3 tech billionaires who genuinely hated each other but had learned to occupy the same social spaces with the practiced civility of diplomats at a summit neither side actually wanted. And then there was the man standing near the refreshment table who didn't belong to any of it. He wasn't hiding, exactly. He was just standing slightly apart from the nearest cluster of guests, holding a glass of sparkling water because he didn't drink at events like this. At events like anything, really, with the particular stillness of someone who had learned a long time ago that staying quiet and watching a room was more useful than filling it with noise. His name was Ethan Walker, and he was 32 years old, and he had spent the last 40 minutes being mistaken for catering staff. 3 times. 3 separate guests had approached him with empty glasses or requests for more bread rolls, and each time he had politely redirected them toward the actual servers without making a thing of it, because making a thing of it wasn't how he operated. The suit he was wearing was clean and pressed. He'd borrowed it from his neighbor Gerald, who was roughly the same height but broader in the shoulders, which meant the jacket fit a little strangely across the chest. His shoes were polished but clearly old. His hair had been recently cut but not styled in any way that suggested he'd thought much about it. He looked like what he was, a man who had come to this thing as a favor to someone else and was doing his best to be appropriately present. The invitation had come through Commander Hartley, retired, who had served 2 tours with Ethan's former unit and now sat on the foundation board of the Whitmore Legacy organization. Hartley had called 3 weeks ago, a Wednesday evening, when Ethan was making his daughter Sophie's dinner and simultaneously attempting to explain long division to an 8-year-old who found the entire concept personally offensive. "Just come," Hartley had said. "You should be around people. It's good for you." "I'm around people," Ethan had said. "I'm around Sophie constantly." Sophie's 8. She has excellent opinions on most things. Hartley had laughed and told him the gala was about veterans' families and fallen service members, that there would be a memorial segment and it might mean something to attend, and Ethan had agreed because he didn't know how to say no to that particular argument without sounding like someone who didn't care about the people he'd served with, which he cared about, maybe more than was healthy. So here he was, in Gerald's slightly too wide suit, holding sparkling water he wasn't really drinking, watching 800 wealthy people navigate a social ecosystem he had no map for, and thinking about Sophie, who was at home with her grandmother watching animated movies and almost certainly eating ice cream in quantities she had been specifically told not to eat. He'd checked his phone twice. Sophie was fine. She'd sent him a photo of herself wrapped in a blanket with a bowl that was definitely too large to contain a reasonable portion of anything. He was smiling at the photo, the private smile of a man who has exactly one person in the world who makes the whole exercise make sense, when he became aware that someone nearby had gone unusually still. He looked up. She was standing about 12 feet away, near the edge of the room where the soft lighting met the shadows between chandeliers, and she was staring at him with an expression he couldn't immediately categorize. Not hostile. Not curious exactly. Something deeper and more complicated than curiosity, the kind of look that came from seeing something you'd convinced yourself you would never see again. He'd noticed her earlier in the evening, the way you couldn't really help noticing the guest of honor at an event like this. Celeste Monroe. The program had half a page on her. Youngest female CEO to ring the opening bell on the New York Stock Exchange. Founder of Vertex Systems. Named to 3 consecutive most influential lists in publications that Ethan had never personally read, but whose cultural weight he understood. She wore a dark navy dress that managed to be both understated and precisely right for the room in a way that probably required money or taste or both. Her hair was pulled back. She'd been working the room for the better part of an hour with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to perform comfort in social situations. The handshakes and the laughs and the leaning in of a person who was genuinely good at being whatever the moment required. But she wasn't performing anything right now. She was just staring at him. And then he realized she wasn't staring at him exactly. She was staring at something lower, at his chest. He glanced down. The dog tags had slipped outside his shirt collar at some point during the evening. He hadn't noticed. He reached up automatically to tuck them back in, but something in the way she moved, a single half step forward, almost involuntary, like her body was responding before her mind had finished processing, made him stop. She walked toward him. The room was loud and crowded and nobody noticed, and he stood very still while she crossed the 12 feet between them and stopped close enough that he could see the way her expression was cycling through something complicated and private and barely contained. Up close, she looked less like a magazine cover and more like a person who was working very hard to stay in control of something. "Where did you get those?" Her voice was quiet, controlled, the kind of quiet that is actually the opposite of calm. Ethan looked down at the tags again. "Ma'am?" "The dog tags." Her eyes came up to his face. "Where did you get them?" He held her gaze. "They were given to me." "Given to you by who?" The pause that followed wasn't long, maybe 2 seconds, but he could see what those 2 seconds cost her, the way she pressed her lips together slightly, the way her chin lifted just a fraction of an inch as if she were bracing for something. "By a man named Daniel Monroe," he said. The sound she made wasn't a gasp. It was smaller than that, a quick fractured exhale, barely audible under the ambient noise of 800 people in a string quartet. Her hand came up and pressed flat against the base of her throat, a gesture she seemed entirely unaware of making. "I think," she said, and her voice was doing something complicated now, something that was almost steady but not quite. "I think I need you to say that again." "Daniel Monroe," Ethan said. "First-class petty officer, SEAL Team 7. He gave them to me personally. I can explain everything, but maybe not." He glanced around at the nearest knot of guests, some of whom had begun to register that something was happening. "Maybe not right here." But it was already too late for not right here, because Celeste Monroe had a security team, and her security team had been watching her the entire evening. And the moment their principals stopped moving through the room and started having what their training described as an emotionally elevated interaction with an unvetted male attendee, 2 of them materialized out of the crowd with the speed and quiet efficiency of people who were paid specifically to materialize. The larger of the 2, a broad, serious man in his 40s with a wire curling behind his ear, stepped between Ethan and Celeste with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back." "I'm fine," Celeste said immediately, her hand dropping from her throat. "Ms. Monroe, Marcus, I said I'm fine." Her voice had found its footing again, the CEO register, the one that didn't invite argument. "Please step back." Marcus didn't step back all the way, but he moved enough to stop blocking the sightline between them. And by then, the people nearby had noticed, because people at events like this were finely calibrated instruments for detecting social disruption, and something about the stillness around Celeste Monroe, The way she had gone completely motionless in a room full of movement had begun to draw attention like a low-frequency signal. A woman in a red dress leaned toward her companion and said something Ethan couldn't hear. A retired general who'd been heading toward the bar slowed and changed course, moving closer with the instinct of someone who sensed that events were developing. Celeste wasn't looking at any of them. She was looking at Ethan. "Those dog tags," she said, and her voice was different now, lower, more deliberate, the words coming out like she was being careful with them because they might break something. "My husband's name and service number are engraved on those tags. Daniel Monroe. He was listed as killed in action 6 years ago during a classified naval operation." She paused. "So I'm going to ask you one more time, very calmly. Where did you get them?" The room around them had grown quieter. Not silent. There were still 400 conversations happening in the same space. But the nearest 20 or 30 people had begun to angle themselves toward this corner of the ballroom in the particular way that crowds do when they sense the center of gravity shifting. Someone said, loudly enough to carry, "Is that her late husband's?" Someone else said, "He could have stolen them." Marcus shifted his weight. His hand moved toward something inside his jacket, then stopped, professional instinct warring with the fact that this was still a charity gala and there were cameras everywhere. "I didn't steal them," Ethan said. He said it without heat, without defensiveness, in the flat, uncomplicated tone of a man stating a fact about the weather. He looked at Marcus directly, then back at Celeste. "I know what this looks like. I understand why you'd think that, but I didn't steal them. And I wasn't going to come here tonight and make a scene, and I'm sorry that this is happening like this. That's not how I wanted it to go." "How did you want it to go?" Celeste asked. Quietly. "I was going to talk to Commander Hartley, ask him to help me figure out the right way to reach you." He exhaled slowly. "Daniel, your husband, he asked me to find you eventually. I've been trying to figure out how to do that without—" He glanced at the crowd around them. "Without this." "Daniel asked you," she repeated. The words landed in the room like something physical. "My husband, who died 6 years ago, asked you to find me." "Yes, ma'am." The ma'am seemed to do something to her. She looked at him differently then. Really looked. The way she hadn't quite managed to yet, taking in the specific quality of his stillness, the way he stood, the particular economy of his movements. 6 years of being married to a Navy SEAL left marks on a person, left them able to recognize certain things. "You served," she said. Not a question. "Yes, ma'am." "SEAL?" A pause. "Yes." She pressed her fingers to her lips briefly, looked away, looked back. Around them, the crowd had consolidated further. Marcus had stopped pretending he wasn't monitoring the situation and was now openly standing close, earpiece live, watching Ethan with the focused attention of someone cataloging threat assessments. The retired general Ethan had noticed earlier had stopped moving entirely and was observing from about 8 feet away with an expression that was difficult to read. "I need everyone to give us some space," Celeste said, to no one in particular. Her voice was very clear. "Now please." The crowd shifted back slightly, the way crowds do when someone with actual authority addresses them, but didn't entirely disperse, human nature being what it is. She turned back to Ethan. "Tell me your name." "Ethan Walker." "Ethan Walker." She said it like she was checking it against something. "And you're saying Daniel knew you? You were on his team?" "Yes." "And he—" She stopped. Started again. "He gave you his dog tags." "In the last hour before the final phase of the mission," Ethan said quietly. "Pressed them into my hand himself." The woman in the red dress nearby made a sound that might have been a sob, or might have been a suppressed gasp. It was hard to tell. Someone else said, "Oh my God," in a hushed voice. The string quartet in the corner, apparently unaware of the drama unfolding on the other side of the room, chose this moment to transition from Vivaldi into something slower and more mournful, which under any other circumstances would have seemed coincidental. Celeste Monroe stood very still in the center of all of it, her hands at her sides, her face doing something privately enormous that the public register of CEO and guest of honor and composed widow was fighting to contain. She was losing that fight. Not dramatically, It wasn't tears or broken composure or anything the crowd surrounding them would have been able to point to later and describe as a breakdown. It was something smaller and more devastating, the particular look of a person who has spent years building an architecture around an unanswered question, and who is beginning to understand that the answer might actually be within reach. "How old is your daughter?" she asked. The question seemed to throw everyone nearby, who were expecting something more directly connected to Daniel, to the tags, to the mission. Ethan blinked. 8, he said. "Her name is Sophie." Celeste nodded slowly, like this confirmed something. "He mentioned you," she said quietly, and something in Ethan's chest did a complicated thing at those 3 words. Not by name. He talked about a guy on his team who'd just become a father. He said, she pressed her lips together for a moment. He said the man was going to be a good one. The silence that followed was the kind that fills up all the available space. Ethan said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. Not in a room full of strangers, not with the weight of 6 years pressing down on both of them from different directions. Marcus touched his earpiece, leaned slightly toward Celeste. "Ma'am, if you'd like to move to one of the private rooms." "Not yet." She didn't look away from Ethan. "I have one more question." "Okay. Is there more to tell? Beyond tonight, beyond this room, is there more that Daniel left with you? More that he needed me to know?" Ethan held her gaze for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "There's a lot more." She nodded. A single, steady nod. The nod of someone who has waited 6 years for an answer and can manage to wait a little longer if it means getting the whole truth. Around them, the Whitmore Legacy Gala continued its elegant, expensive evening. The string quartet played. The chandeliers threw their fractured light. 800 guests in their finest clothes ate and drank and bid on private islands and afternoons with senators. But in the corner of the 42nd floor, near the refreshment table, a woman who had carried a quiet and unanswered grief for 6 years was standing in front of the man who had been carrying it with her, without either of them knowing it, for just as long. And neither of them moved. Not yet. Because some moments, even the painful ones, especially the painful ones, deserve to be held for just a second before the world starts moving again. Marcus was not a man who made mistakes twice. In 14 years of private security work, 8 of those years protecting Celeste Monroe specifically, he had learned to read a room the way other people read faces, cataloging exits and angles, and the particular body language of people who were about to do something unpredictable. He had removed 3 individuals from Celeste's presence over the years who had seemed perfectly reasonable right up until they weren't. He had once physically placed himself between her and a man at a shareholder meeting who turned out to be completely harmless but whose aggressive stride had triggered something in Marcus's training that he'd learned to trust without questioning. He did not trust Ethan Walker. Not because Walker seemed dangerous exactly. It was almost the opposite. The man was too still, too composed, too unbothered by the crowd gathering around him and the security team flanking him, and the fact that one word from Celeste could have him removed from the building in under 90 seconds. People who weren't hiding anything didn't usually carry that kind of stillness. In Marcus's experience, that particular brand of calm belonged either to people who had been in genuinely worse situations and had the perspective to know this wasn't one, or to people who were very, very good at controlling what they showed. He leaned close to Celeste's ear. "Miss Monroe, I strongly recommend we move this to a private space and have my team verify this individual's identity before you continue any conversation with him." "I heard you the first time, Marcus. With respect, find me a room." She said it quietly, but the sentence had edges. "A private one. And get Commander Hartley. I know he's here somewhere. I saw him near the East Bar 20 minutes ago." Marcus straightened. He exchanged a look with his second, a younger woman named Priya, who had been tracking the crowd density around them with the patient focus of someone counting potential problems. Priya nodded once and moved toward the east side of the ballroom. "And nobody follows us," Celeste added, louder now, directed at the loose ring of guests who had accumulated in the surrounding 10 feet. Some of them had their phones out. That was going to be a problem regardless of what happened next, but there was nothing useful she could do about it in this moment. "Please, give us privacy." The crowd shuffled back with the slightly guilty compliance of people who know they've been caught staring and don't have a good defense for it. Ethan hadn't moved through any of this. He was still standing in exactly the same spot, holding his glass of sparkling water, watching her with the measured attention of someone who was in no hurry and had learned that hurrying rarely improved anything. There was something about the way he held himself, a specific quality of patience that didn't feel passive, that kept snagging at the edge of her awareness, pulling at something she couldn't quite name. "Walk with me," she said to him. "Okay." Not "yes, ma'am" this time, just "okay." The shift was small, but she noticed it. The room Marcus secured was a conference space off the main corridor. Not glamorous, fluorescent lit in the way that exposed every detail, without flattering any of them, furnished with a long table and 8 chairs and a whiteboard on the far wall that still had someone's event logistics written on it in red marker. A water pitcher on a credenza. The distant sound of the string quartet leaking under the door. Celeste sat down at the head of the table. Ethan took a seat along the side, leaving 2 chairs between himself and Marcus, who remained standing near the door with his arms at his sides, and his expression set to something between professional neutrality and active suspicion. They waited without talking. The silence wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the silence of 2 people who both had things to say and weren't ready to say them yet. Commander Hartley arrived in under 5 minutes, which told Celeste that Priya had moved fast and that Hartley hadn't needed much convincing. He was a compact man in his early 60s with gray at his temples and the permanently slightly squinting expression of someone who had spent a lot of years looking at things far away. He stepped into the conference room, looked at Ethan, and stopped. Something moved across his face. "Walker," he said. Not a question. "Admiral," Ethan said, and then corrected himself. "Commander. Sorry." "Don't be." Hartley pulled out the chair across from Ethan and sat down heavily. The way men sit when their knees have started giving them opinions. He looked at Celeste. "How much has he told you?" "Almost nothing," she said. "I wouldn't let him explain in the middle of the ballroom." "That was smart." Hartley folded his hands on the table. "What I can tell you right now before he says a word, I know who this man is. I served 2 years tangentially connected to his unit. His record is real, his service is real, and he is not someone who steals things." He looked at Marcus without warmth. "Whatever your people are currently running on him, whatever flags are coming up because he showed up here without a corporate LinkedIn profile and a country club membership, set that aside." Marcus said nothing, but his posture adjusted by approximately 2 degrees in the direction of less hostile. "Okay," Celeste said. She looked at Ethan. "Then talk to me." Ethan set his water glass down. He looked at the table for a moment, and she could see him organizing something internally, not stalling, not performing reluctance, but doing the particular work of someone who has carried a thing for a long time and is trying to figure out the right place to begin. "The mission was in November 6 years ago," he said. "I can't tell you the location or the specific objective. Some of that's still classified, and some of it I just don't talk about. What I can tell you is that it went sideways before we were even on the ground. The intelligence was bad. We didn't know how bad until we were already in it." He paused, picked up the water glass, then set it back down without drinking. "There were 8 of us on the primary team. Daniel was the senior enlisted. He exhaled through his nose. "I was newer, relatively. I'd been in the unit about 14 months. Daniel was 6 years in. He knew everything I was still learning, and he had a way of making you feel like the team was going to be fine even when the situation was clearly not fine, which in that line of work is genuinely useful." A brief pause. "He talked about you. Not constantly, not in a way that felt like he was homesick or distracted. Just sometimes when we had downtime, he'd mention something you'd said or something you'd done and he'd get this look. Like he was holding something warm." Celeste's jaw tightened slightly. She said nothing. "He knew I'd just had Sophie," Ethan continued. "She was 4 months old when I deployed. He gave me a hard time about it. In a good way, the way guys do. He said I was going to come home, and she was going to have my nose, and I was going to be insufferable about it for the rest of my life." The corner of his mouth moved. He was right about the nose. "Mr. Walker." Her voice was careful, precise. "The dog tags. I'm getting there. I know, She pressed her fingers to the bridge of her nose. I need you to understand that I have sat with the way he died, the way I was told he died. For 6 years, I have built something around that. Not peace exactly, but a structure. And right now that structure is doing something I cannot manage in small pieces. So I need you to tell me what happened, the actual thing. Ethan looked at her steadily. He understood that. He respected it. On the third night, he said, we were trying to reach the extraction point, and we couldn't. The route was compromised. We'd lost 2 men by then. Not Daniel, but 2 others. And we had 4 civilians we were responsible for, people we'd pulled from a location I can't specify. Getting those civilians out was the entire point of the mission. That hadn't changed. He leaned forward slightly, forearms on the table. There was 1 helicopter. It could take the 4 civilians and maybe 3 of our guys. Overloaded, bad odds in the terrain we were in, but possible. Daniel ran the numbers out loud, which was something he did when the math was bad, and he needed everyone to understand why a decision was being made. He stopped. The number said not everyone could get on that helicopter. Someone had to stay back and hold the position long enough for it to get clear. The room was very quiet. Hartley was looking at the table. Marcus had stopped shifting his weight. He didn't frame it as a sacrifice, Ethan said. He never used that word. He said it was a tactical decision, and that he'd made it, and that it wasn't up for discussion. And then he looked at me specifically and said, he stopped again, and this time the pause was different. A breath held against something. He said, Walker, you've got a daughter. Get on the helicopter. Celeste made a sound, very small, very controlled. I told him no, Ethan said. For the record, I told him no, and I meant it, and he knew I meant it, and it didn't change anything. He was the senior man, and he had made the call, and that was the end of the argument. He wasn't angry about it. He put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, this is not a discussion. This is an order. Take care of the civilians, and get home to your kid. He swallowed. And then he pulled the dog tags off his own neck, and he pressed them into my hand, and he said, he stopped. Celeste leaned forward almost without realizing it. He said, find Celeste. When the time is right, find her, and tell her that every single thing I did because I loved her. Not because I was brave, not because it was the right thing, because I loved her, and I wanted her to live in a world where she was safe. And this is how I make that happen. Tell her I wasn't alone. Tell her I wasn't scared. And tell her to stop working so damn hard all the time because she doesn't have to prove anything to anyone. The last sentence broke something in the room. Celeste Monroe, who had not cried at a funeral, who had not cried when they handed her a folded flag, who had built a company and a career and a perfectly organized life around the specific project of not crumbling, pressed both hands flat against the conference table and stared at a point somewhere past Ethan's left shoulder and breathed very carefully through her nose. Once, twice, 3 times. That last part, she said, and her voice was not quite steady. About working too hard. Yes. He said that to me. Those exact words. 3 days before he deployed. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh, and almost something else entirely. I'd been pulling 18-hour days because we were in the middle of a product launch, and he sat down next to me at my desk at 11 o'clock at night, and he said, she stopped. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Celeste. Not to me, not to the board, not to whoever it is you're actually doing all this for. She looked at Ethan directly then, and for the first time since this began, there was something other than careful control in her face. There was something raw and certain and almost fragile in the way that the truth, when it finally arrives, can feel fragile even when it's exactly what you needed. He told you to say that, she said. He specifically told you to say that. Yes, because he knew I'd recognize it. I think so, yes. She sat back in her chair. The room breathed. Hartley cleared his throat gently. Celeste, I want to say, the mission Ethan is describing is consistent with a classified after-action report I was partially briefed on about 8 months after the fact. What he's telling you is not inconsistent with what I know. Not inconsistent, Marcus said from the door, in the flat tone of a man who processes information differently. That's not confirmation. No, Hartley agreed, but I can make some calls tomorrow morning that could move it closer to confirmation if that's what she needs. He looked at Celeste. Is that what you need? She thought about that. Really thought about it. I know he's telling the truth, she said. It wasn't defiance or naivety. It was simply a statement. Daniel spent 2 years trying to get me to slow down, and he had a specific way of doing it. Not lectures, not arguments. He'd just say one thing, the exact right thing, and then let it sit. The working too hard line was his. She paused. Nobody else knew that. Ethan said nothing. He understood that she wasn't talking to him right now. I need to know about the rest of it, she said, looking back at him. He said every decision was made out of love. I need to understand what that means. The decision to stay, was it... She stopped and reorganized. Did he have any doubt? Did he hesitate? No, Ethan said. And then because he believed she deserved the more complicated version, not about the decision. He was, I've thought about this a lot for 6 years. I've turned it over 100 times. He wasn't fearless. I want to be clear about that because I think fearless is actually not what you want to hear. He was afraid. He was human. But the fear didn't reach the decision. The decision was already made before the fear had time to argue about it. She absorbed that. He said not to tell me he was scared, she said quietly. You said he told you he wasn't scared. He did tell me that. And I'm telling you both things because I think you're someone who can hold both things at once. He met her eyes. He was afraid, and the decision was still immediate and certain. Both of those are true. Celeste Monroe looked at Ethan Walker for a long moment. This borrowed suit, sparkling water, mistaken for catering staff, single father from somewhere that wasn't here, who had walked into the Whitmore Legacy Gala carrying 6 years of someone else's final words. And something in her expression shifted into a territory that was harder to read than grief or gratitude or even recognition. It was something like relief. The particular devastating relief of a burden finally set down. You carried that for 6 years, she said. Yes. Alone. He thought about Sophie, asleep in his apartment with her grandmother, surrounded by the evidence of a life he'd built around exactly this weight. Not entirely alone, he said, but mostly. From outside the door, muffled by carpet and corridor and 42 floors of expensive hotel construction, the string quartet had moved into something quieter, something that didn't demand attention but simply occupied the air. The red marker logistics notes on the whiteboard, stage right, podium, auction items 1 to 12, seemed faintly absurd in the context of what was happening in this room. Celeste reached up slowly and touched the dog tags where they rested against Ethan's shirt, not taking them, just resting her fingertips against the worn metal for a moment. His jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't pull back. She could feel the edges of the engraving without looking. She'd felt them 1,000 times before, on the nights when Daniel was home, and she'd fall asleep with her hand against his chest. She knew exactly what they said. She didn't need to read them. She pulled her hand back. I want to hear everything, she said. Not tonight. Tonight is 2. She gestured vaguely at the room, the gala beyond it, the entire complicated evening. But I want to hear all of it. The mission, what he said, what he was like in those last hours. Everything you're able to tell me. I'll tell you everything I can, Ethan said. There are things that are still classified, and I'll tell you that when I hit them. But everything else, yes, whatever you want to know. She nodded. Marcus stirred near the door, preparing to suggest that they return to the event, that they table this for a more appropriate time and setting, that there were 800 guests and a charity auction that had technically been the point of the evening. He opened his mouth. Celeste looked at him. He closed it. One more thing, she said to Ethan. Right now, tonight. She folded her hands on the table. Her knuckles were not quite white. Did he make it out? After the helicopter left. Do you know what happened after? The question sat in the room, and nobody touched it for a moment. Ethan had known she was going to ask this. He had known it was coming from the moment she said she wanted to know everything, because it was the only question that really mattered, the one underneath all the others, the one 6 years of not knowing had been quietly built around. He held the position long enough, he said, long enough for the helicopter to clear the area. We know that because we cleared. We know that he stopped, chose his words with a care that was itself a kind of answer. He completed the mission, Celeste. She held his gaze, reading what he hadn't said. understanding it. He completed the mission, she repeated softly. Yes. She was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to become its own kind of answer. Then she said, okay. And the word carried the weight of something finally, irrevocably set down. Hartley reached across the table and put his hand briefly over hers. He didn't say anything, which was the right choice. Outside, the gala continued. The auction was probably underway. Somewhere in the ballroom, someone was bidding on a private island or an afternoon with a senator. And the chandeliers were still throwing their fractured light across 800 people who had no idea that in a fluorescent conference room off the main corridor, something that had been suspended for 6 years had just, quietly, without ceremony or announcement, finally come to rest. Celeste Monroe sat straight in her chair and pressed her lips together and breathed. And Ethan Walker, who had carried a dead man's final words across 6 years and one impossible evening, sat across from her and let the silence be exactly what it needed to be. Which was enough. For now, it was enough. They went back to the ballroom eventually, not because either of them wanted to, and not because the evening's original purpose, the auction, the speeches, the careful choreography of wealth being redistributed toward causes that deserved it, suddenly felt more important than what had just happened in that conference room. They went back because Celeste had obligations she couldn't simply abandon, and because Ethan understood obligations, and because Commander Hartley pointed out quietly that there were already photographs circulating on social media of Celeste Monroe having what several captions described as a tense confrontation with an unidentified man near the refreshment table, and that the longer she stayed invisible, the more room that left for people to fill with speculation. I hate that he's right, Celeste said, standing in the corridor outside the conference room, pressing 2 fingers briefly against her left temple. He usually is, Ethan said, a knowing quality in a person. Hartley, walking ahead of them, said without turning around, I can hear you both. It was the first moment since the dog tags that felt remotely like something ordinary, and Celeste registered it with a flicker of surprise. The way a person notices unexpected warmth on a cold day, slightly disoriented by the contrast. She stopped walking. Ethan stopped too, half a step later. I need to ask you something before we go back in there, she said. And I need you to answer it honestly, not carefully. Okay, when Daniel gave you those tags, in that moment, on the ground, with everything happening around you, did he seem like he knew what the outcome was going to be? Did he seem like a man who believed he was going to die? Or like a man who was making a tactical decision that happened to include significant personal risk? Ethan was quiet for a beat, not avoiding the question, working toward the honest version of it. Both, he said finally. And I think he knew they were the same thing in that moment, and he'd made his peace with that before he said a word to any of us. He paused. He wasn't performing calm. You know the difference when you've been in situations like that. Some guys perform calm because they think the team needs to see it. Daniel wasn't performing. He was actually calm, which, depending on how you look at it, is either the most frightening thing or the most reassuring. Which was it for you? He considered that honestly. Reassuring, he said. In the moment. It's gotten more complicated since. She nodded slowly, took a breath, straightened the front of her jacket with the precise, practiced movement of a woman who had spent a decade learning to compose herself on command. All right, she said. Let's go back in. The ballroom received her return with the particular appetite of a room that has been waiting for something to happen. Heads turned, conversations paused at the edges. The event coordinator, a brittle-looking woman named Patricia, who had been visibly managing anxiety for the past 40 minutes, materialized at Celeste's elbow with the desperate relief of someone welcoming back a life raft. Ms. Monroe, the live auction is about to begin, and Mr. Whitmore would like you at the head table for— Give me 10 minutes, Celeste said. The program set— Patricia, 10 minutes. Patricia retreated. Ethan had stopped a few feet behind her, creating distance, instinctively reverting to the position he'd occupied for most of the evening. Peripheral, unobtrusive, waiting. But Celeste half turned and said, Stay close, without looking directly at him, and he moved back into her orbit without comment. She worked the room the way she always did, but differently. Something had shifted in the specific texture of her attention, the way she looked at people. She was present in a way she hadn't been earlier, less managed and more actual, The performance of ease replaced by something that cost more but landed with more weight. People responded to it without knowing why. 3 separate conversations in those 10 minutes ran longer than she intended because the other person simply didn't want to stop talking to her. Ethan watched this from close enough to observe, but far enough to stay invisible, and thought that Daniel had been right about her. The working too hard thing. It wasn't a criticism, he understood now. It was concern. It was Daniel seeing someone he loved pushing at a pace that left no room for the kind of rest that actually mattered, and not knowing how to say that except obliquely, with a single sentence at 11 o'clock at night. He thought about that for a moment. The specific loneliness of loving someone who keeps outrunning their own grief. Then he thought about Sophie, checked his phone again. A picture of his daughter asleep on the couch, with a spoon still in her hand, and an ice cream container nearby that his mother-in-law had photographed with the caption, "She fought hard, but the gelato won," and allowed himself a quiet exhale that was the closest thing he'd had to a full breath all evening. The auction proceeded. Celeste took her seat at the head table. Ethan found a chair near the back of the room at a table with Commander Hartley and 2 other retired officers whose names he didn't catch, and the evening moved forward with the momentum of an expensive machine that had been set in motion long before either of them arrived and would continue long after they left. But something had changed in the room. Not visibly, not in any way Patricia or the event coordinator or the 3 tech billionaires would have been able to point to. It was more atmospheric, the way weather can change before the actual weather arrives, a shift in pressure that the body registers before the mind names it. People kept looking at Ethan, not rudely, not with the open staring of the ballroom 40 minutes earlier. Sidelong glances. The quiet, recursive attention of people who have heard something significant and are trying to recalibrate their understanding of a room they thought they already understood. One of the retired officers at his table, a broad man with a white mustache who introduced himself only as Reeves, leaned toward Ethan during a break between auction items and said in a low voice, "Word travels fast at these things." "Apparently," Ethan said, "they're saying you were on the team, the Monroe mission." Ethan didn't confirm or deny. Reeves nodded as if he had. Danny Monroe was a good man, exceptional operator, the kind they don't replace. He straightened his fork on the tablecloth, a gesture that had no function but occupied his hands. "What you did tonight, coming here, telling her, that took something." "It took 6 years," Ethan said, "which is longer than it should have." "Timing's a hard thing. You get it right when you get it right." Reeves picked up his wine glass. "She needed to know. You can see it in her. She's been holding a particular kind of weight, the not knowing kind. That's the heaviest variety." Ethan said nothing, because there was nothing to add to that. Across the room, at the head table, Celeste Monroe sat through a 20-minute live auction with the composed attentiveness of someone who had spent a career learning to be fully present in rooms that didn't entirely deserve her presence. She bid on 2 items, a medical scholarship fund package and a piece of original artwork whose proceeds went to a veterans housing initiative, and won one of them and gracefully conceded the other to a hedge fund manager who clearly wanted it more and had the resources to prove it. And every few minutes, without seeming to, she looked toward the back of the room. Ethan was usually looking somewhere else when she did, but not always. It was after 11 when the formal program ended and the room shifted into the loose, unstructured social phase of an event running on expensive wine and the accumulated goodwill of people who had spent money for a cause and felt virtuous about it. The string quartet packed up. A DJ materialized. The lighting dropped approximately 30% and went warmer. Celeste appeared at Ethan's table with a glass of water. She'd switched from champagne sometime after the auction and pulled out the chair across from him and sat down without asking whether it was convenient, which he appreciated. People who asked whether it was convenient to sit down usually weren't actually asking. Hartley and Reeves immediately found somewhere else to be, with the diplomatic instinct of men who had learned to read exits. "I want to hear the rest of it," she said. "The parts you couldn't tell me in the conference room." He looked at her steadily. "Some of it I still can't tell you." "I know, the parts you can." He was quiet for a moment, deciding where to enter the story. Not the official version, not the carefully edited account he'd given in the conference room under the observation of Marcus and Hartley, but the actual thing. The texture of those hours that didn't exist in any after-action report, because the details that mattered most were never the ones that made it into official documentation. We'd been on the ground for about 36 hours when everything fell apart, he said. The intelligence failure was comprehensive, almost impressively bad. The location we'd been told was a staging point for the extraction of the civilians turned out to be actively contested. We walked into something we didn't have the numbers to control. He kept his voice low. The DJ across the room was playing something with a steady, indifferent bass line that provided cover. Daniel's first move, when the situation became clear, was the civilians. He didn't pivot to escape planning, didn't start running contingencies for the team first. His first question was about the status of the civilians, and his second question was whether we had a clean route to get them out. Ethan paused. That was Daniel. In all the years I knew him, his calculus always ran in a specific order, and the mission objective, the actual thing, the people we were there for, was always at the top. That's not nothing, Celeste said quietly. A lot of people say they do that, and then the moment comes and they don't. No, it's not nothing. He turned his water glass a quarter turn on the tablecloth. The second night was when we started losing men. Not from direct fire, from the situation developing in ways we couldn't control. Peterson went first. He was covering a route we needed to hold, and the route became untenable, and he didn't make it out of it. Then Carver, during a repositioning. He stopped. I'm not going to tell you their full names tonight. Their families know what happened to them, and that's not my story to revisit here. Understood. By the third night, there were 5 of us left plus the 4 civilians. The helicopter was a single asset, the only extraction available given how compromised the surrounding area was. And Daniel did the math. He exhaled slowly. He did it out loud the way I told you. He listed the weight, the fuel load, the distance to the nearest safe corridor, the number of bodies the helicopter could realistically carry at altitude in that terrain. He walked all 5 of us through it, step by step, like a briefing. Celeste was watching him with an expression that was entirely still. Not frozen. There was too much moving behind her eyes for frozen, but contained, deliberately contained. And at the end of the math, Ethan continued, he said, we need someone to stay and hold this position for approximately 20 minutes. Enough time for the helicopter to clear the immediate threat envelope. And then he looked at each of us, one at a time, and nobody said anything because we all understood the arithmetic. He stopped, picked up his water glass and put it back down. Ortega volunteered, he said. He was the first one to speak. He said he'd do it. Daniel looked at him for a long moment and then said, You've got 3 kids under 7. Get on the helicopter. He paused. Torres said he'd do it. Daniel said, Your mother's sick. Get on the helicopter. Then he looked at me. I didn't say anything. I knew what was coming. He said, Your daughter is 4 months old, and you've never even held her for more than 2 days at a time because of deployments. Get on the helicopter, Walker. The DJ across the room had shifted into something slower. The bass line continued its steady, indifferent pulse. And then he said, Ethan continued, his voice dropping slightly, I'm the right person for this. I know that, and you all know that. My math is different from yours, and that's not a tragedy. That's just how it works out. What did he mean? Celeste said carefully. His math is different. Ethan met her eyes. He'd thought a long time about how to say this part. Daniel was 31, he said. You two hadn't been able to have children. I don't know the details, and I'm not asking, but he'd talked about it. Not extensively, not in a way that seemed like open grief, but I knew it was something he carried. He didn't say it directly that night. He just said his math was different, but I understood what he meant. He paused. He meant that the weight of his absence in the world was not smaller, not less, just differently distributed. You were his person, but you were strong. He told me you were the strongest person he'd ever known, and I think part of him believed that in a way that was true, and in a way that maybe wasn't entirely fair to you. She made a sound, not quite a laugh. He thought I'd be fine. He thought you'd survive it, which isn't the same thing, and I think part of him knew that, and it was the one part of the calculation he couldn't fully make peace with. Ethan looked at her directly. He wasn't at peace with leaving you. I want to be clear about that, because the story can sound like like a man who had everything figured out and made a clean, noble choice and walked away without looking back. That's not what I saw. He was at peace with the tactical decision. The operational logic was settled. But when he handed me the dog tags, he stopped. His hand wasn't entirely steady. Something broke open in Celeste's face and then closed again almost immediately, the way a wound will show itself briefly before the body's instinct for self-protection reasserts. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for exactly 2 seconds. Then she put her hand back on the table. "Tell me the rest," she said. Her voice was rough at the edges. "We argued," Ethan said. "One more time." Ortega tried again, said he'd stay, said he could hold the position as well as anyone. Daniel shut it down with one sentence. He said, "I've given you an order and this conversation is finished, and I need every one of you to get on that helicopter in the next 4 minutes, or the math stops working in anyone's favor." And that was it. We moved. He was quiet for a moment, looking at a point past her shoulder. I was the last one on before the door closed. Daniel was about 40 meters back from the landing zone, already in position, already doing what needed to be done. And He stopped, cleared his throat. I looked at him. He didn't look back at the helicopter. He was already facing the other direction, already focused forward, and then the door closed. Celeste was very still. "We cleared the area in about 4 minutes," Ethan said. "The sounds from the ground stopped approximately 90 seconds after that, which means he held it," she said. "He held it." She looked down at the tablecloth. The DJ was playing something with no particular emotional agenda, cheerful and anonymous, and its complete indifference to the conversation happening at this table was somehow exactly right. The world continuing to function alongside the private enormous things that people carry through it. "He wasn't alone," she said. It wasn't a question, but there was something in it that needed confirming. "No," Ethan said. "He wasn't, not for the first part of it." And he left it there, because that was the true thing and the kind thing together, and some details existed for the after-action report, and some existed only between the people who had been there. She looked up at him then, really looked, the way she'd been looking at him all evening, but differently now, without the specific urgency of trying to determine whether he was real, whether this was real, whether the thing she was being told was actually the answer to 6 years of questions. That urgency had quieted. What was left was something plainer and harder. "You came here tonight," she said, "in a borrowed suit." He started slightly. "It's that obvious?" "The shoulders," she said simply. "You came here in a borrowed suit to a charity gala you clearly would not have chosen to attend, because a man you served with 6 years ago asked you to find me. And you've been carrying that for 6 years without trying to find a way to turn it into something for yourself. No book deal, no, interview, no..." She gestured vaguely. "You're a marine mechanic." "Good marine mechanic," he said. "I'm sure." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely categorize. Why did it take 6 years? It was the question he'd asked himself most often. He had answers. The classification status, the uncertainty about how to approach her without causing more damage than healing, the weight of single parenthood, and the particular way grief can make you postpone the things that feel too large to face directly. All of those answers were true. "Honestly," he said, "because I was afraid I'd make it worse, that I'd show up with Daniel's last words, and they'd land wrong. And instead of giving you something, I'd just reopen something, and I'd have no way to know which way it was going to go." He paused. "Sophie started 2nd grade this year. On the first day of school, she walked in without looking back, didn't hold my hand, didn't even wave. And I stood at the door of the school watching her go, and I thought..." He stopped. "I thought Daniel would have wanted to see that. He would have wanted Sophie to be the kind of kid who walks in without looking back. And I thought about you, and whether you'd been given the chance to move forward the way she did, and..." He exhaled. "Hartley called about the gala the next day. I said yes." Celeste Monroe sat across from Ethan Walker at a table in the back of the Whitmore Legacy Gala ballroom, in the indifferent glow of a DJ's lighting rig, with the noise of 300 conversations and glasses and someone's ill-timed burst of laughter filling the air around them. And she did something she had not done, not once, in 6 years. She let herself cry. Not dramatically, not the way grief is depicted in movies, the way it performs itself for an audience. Two tears, close together, tracking down the left side of her face. Her chin didn't wobble, her breath didn't hitch. She just let two tears happen while she looked at the tablecloth, and then she pressed the corner of a cocktail napkin briefly against her face and set it back down. "Okay," she said. Her voice was steady. Ethan said nothing. He understood that nothing was the correct response. "Okay," she said again, quieter this time. Not to him, just to herself. The particular okay of a person releasing a tension they have held for so long they'd stop noticing it as tension. Around them, the gala moved through its final hour. The DJ continued. The overhead lights had warmed to something amber and forgiving. People were making the particular slow drift toward coats and conversations and car services that signaled the end of an event, the gentle dissolution of an assembled world back into its component parts. But at the table in the back of the room, Ethan Walker and Celeste Monroe sat in the specific quiet of two people who had said everything that needed to be said tonight, and neither of them moved toward leaving, and neither of them said another word for a long time, which was its own kind of completion, not the end of anything. Just the first moment, after 6 very long years, that felt like solid ground. The room cleared slowly, the way rooms do after events that have cost people something. Not money, though there had been plenty of that moving around tonight, but the particular expenditure of sustained social performance, the energy required to be interesting and interested and appropriately impressive for 4 consecutive hours. Guests drifted toward the exits in small clusters, the conversations thinning, the laughter getting looser and less careful. Coats appeared. Car services were summoned via phones held discreetly under tables. Celeste and Ethan stayed where they were. Nobody approached them. Marcus remained visible. He was always visible. That was the point of Marcus. But he'd pulled back to a respectful distance sometime in the last hour, close enough to respond if needed, and far enough to understand that his presence was currently an intrusion. It was the most sophisticated thing Celeste had seen him do in years, and she made a mental note to tell him so later. Commander Hartley had stopped by the table once, around 11:30, and simply placed his hand briefly on Ethan's shoulder without saying anything, and then walked away toward the coat check. Reeves had done something similar, a small nod in Ethan's direction that carried more weight than most speeches. The DJ packed up. The overhead lights came back to full brightness with the slightly brutal efficiency of a venue that needed to transition from event to cleanup, and the room went from amber and forgiving to fluorescent and practical in about 30 seconds, which was, Celeste thought, a fairly accurate metaphor for most things. She looked at Ethan in the full light. He looked tired in a way he probably hadn't allowed himself to show all evening, the specific tiredness of someone who has been braced for something for a very long time and has finally, in the last hour, been able to release that brace. There were lines around his eyes that probably looked deeper right now than usual. His borrowed jacket was slightly rumpled. He'd stopped pretending to drink the sparkling water at some point, and the glass sat empty and forgotten at the edge of the table. "You should get home," she said. "Sophie. My mother-in-law has her. She's fine." "Still," he looked at her. "Are you trying to get rid of me, or are you trying to make sure I have somewhere to be?" "The second one," she said without hesitation. He nodded slowly, accepting that. "I'm okay. She's asleep by now regardless. Another hour doesn't change anything." Celeste turned her water glass on the tablecloth. "Mother-in-law," she said. "Your wife—" "She passed," Ethan said. 4 years ago. Aneurysm. Completely without warning." He said it the way people say things they've said many times, not without feeling, but with the particular economy of someone who has found the version of those words that gets through the necessary exchange without reopening everything. Sophie was 4. She doesn't have a lot of memory of her mother, which is its own kind of complicated thing to navigate. "I'm sorry," Celeste said. And then, because it felt insufficient, "That's a lot of loss for one family." "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "Sophie's a good kid, though. She's actually kind of remarkable. Not because I think that as her dad, though I do think that as her dad. She's just got this quality of... She takes people seriously. She looks at you like what you have to say matters. 8 years old, and she does that." He paused. "Daniel would have liked her." "He would have," Celeste agreed and meant it, and the past tense of it landed between them with the familiar weight of something you learn to carry rather than put down. Across the ballroom, 2 venue staff members were beginning the quiet work of clearing tables, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had cleaned up after 1,000 events and knew exactly how long this would take, and would prefer that the remaining guests understood this without being told directly. "I need to ask you something," Ethan said, "and you don't have to answer it." She waited. "The dog tags." He reached up and touched them briefly through his shirt. "Do you want them back?" The question sat in the air between them. It was the obvious question, the one that had been present in the room since she'd first seen them around his neck near the refreshment table, the gravitational center that everything else had been orbiting. They were Daniel's. His name, his service number, the physical object that had been pressed against his chest for years, and had ended up in the hands of a man she'd never met in the course of an evening that had rearranged her understanding of the last 6 years. Of course she should want them back. She looked at Ethan's face, at the tiredness in it, and the steadiness underneath the tiredness, and the specific quality of a man who had organized a significant portion of his adult life around something he was carrying for someone else. And she thought about what it would mean to take them. Not just to her, but to the particular equation of the thing. Daniel had given them to Ethan deliberately, not as a keepsake, not as a token, not as evidence. He'd given them as a transfer of something that couldn't be named directly. The responsibility, the promise, the weight of what needed to be carried forward. Taking them back would be recovering a possession. It wouldn't be honoring what they actually represented. She reached across the table. Ethan went very still. She lifted the chain from where it rested inside his collar, gently, with both hands, and held the dog tags in her palm for a moment. The metal was warm from his skin. She rubbed her thumb across the engraving. Daniel Monroe, his service number, his blood type. And she allowed herself 10 full seconds of something private and irretrievable that she didn't try to name or contain or manage. Then she reached up and placed the chain back around Ethan's neck. He exhaled. "He gave them to you," she said. "You made a choice about who should carry them. I'm not going to undo that." She sat back in her chair. "But I want you to know that I know what they are, and I know what it means that you wore them here tonight." Ethan looked at her with an expression that had too many things in it to categorize cleanly. "Thank you," he said. It wasn't sufficient language for what he meant, and they both understood that. "Don't thank me." She shook her head slightly. "If anything, the accounting runs the other direction." They sat with that for a moment. It was Marcus who interrupted, appearing at Celeste's elbow with the respectful but non-negotiable presence of a man whose job it was to move her toward exits at appropriate intervals. "Ms. Monroe, the car is ready whenever you are, and there are 3 journalists in the lobby who weren't there an hour ago, so the timing is relevant," she finished. "Yes." She stood, and the room rearranged itself around her standing. The last few guests near the exits glanced over. The venue staff adjusted their trajectories slightly, the specific gravity of the evening finding its final configuration. Ethan stood too. They looked at each other in the full fluorescent light of a ballroom being actively returned to a neutral state, which was not a romantic setting by any measure, and the complete absence of atmosphere was somehow exactly right for what came next. "I'm going to do something," Celeste said, "in Daniel's name. I've been thinking about it for a while. Before tonight, even. And tonight has made it clear rather than uncertain." She paused. "I don't know the exact shape of it yet, but it has to do with the families, the people left behind, the children especially." She looked at him steadily. "I'd like to talk to you about it. Not tonight. Next week, when we've both slept and the whole thing has settled into something I can think about clearly." "Okay," he said. "I mean it. Not as a formality. I want your actual input, from someone who's actually lived in the specific situation I'm trying to address." He nodded. "I'll tell you what I know, which is more than I'd like it to be in some respects." "I know." She reached into the small clutch bag that had been sitting on the table all evening and produced a card. Plain, cream-colored, just her name and a direct number, no title, no company logo. She held it out to him. "My direct line. Not the assistant, not the main office. This goes to me." He took it, looked at it for a moment, tucked it into his jacket pocket. "I'll call," he said. I'm not good at following up on things like this, I'll tell you that up front. Sophie's school schedule is, I'm not making excuses, I just want to set accurate expectations. I'll call you if I don't hear from you by Wednesday, she said. That works. She put out her hand. He shook it. It was a strange gesture, given everything that had passed between them in the last several hours. And they both knew it was strange, and neither of them changed it, because sometimes the formal gesture is the one that acknowledges the scale of what just happened better than anything more effusive would. Take care of that kid, she said. Always, he said. She turned and walked toward the exit with Marcus, and Ethan watched her go. And then he stood alone in the nearly empty ballroom of the Harrington Grand Hotel on the 42nd floor and reached up and touched the dog tags through his shirt once, briefly, and felt the specific weight of something completed. Not resolved, exactly. Completed. Those were different things, he had learned. Resolution implied a problem that had been solved. Completion implied a thing that had been carried to its destination. He found his coat. He found Commander Hartley near the elevator, who shook his hand with both of his and said, "You did good tonight, son," which should have been a cliché and somehow wasn't. He rode the elevator down 42 floors with 2 venue staff members who were talking about their weekend plans and paid no attention to him whatsoever, which felt correct. In the lobby, there were indeed 3 journalists, 2 with cameras and 1 with a phone held at a recording angle, who tracked Celeste's exit through the glass doors with the focused attention of people doing their jobs. Nobody paid any attention to the man in the slightly ill-fitting borrowed suit who walked out behind her security team and turned left toward the parking structure. He sat in his truck for a few minutes before starting it, not thinking anything in particular, just sitting in the specific quiet of a parked car at midnight, with the city doing what cities do around you, constant and indifferent and full. He called his mother-in-law. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake. "Everything all right?" "Yeah," he said. "Everything's fine. How is she?" "Asleep on the couch. I tried to move her to her bed, and she informed me in her sleep that she was completely comfortable and I should mind my own business." He smiled. "That sounds right. How was the event?" He thought about how to answer that, about the ballroom and the borrowed suit and the sparkling water and the dog tags catching the light at the wrong angle, about a woman who hadn't cried in 6 years pressing 2 fingers briefly against her left temple in a hotel corridor, about Daniel Monroe's hand not being entirely steady as he pressed 6 years of promise into someone else's keeping. "It was something," he said. His mother-in-law was quiet for a moment, the way she sometimes was when she understood that the full answer wasn't coming tonight. "Get home safe," she said finally. "Sophie will want to tell you about the gelato situation first thing." "I know about the gelato situation," he said. "There are photographic records." She laughed, and he started the truck, and he drove home through the midnight city thinking about all of it, the whole improbable weight of the evening. And by the time he pulled into his parking spot, something had settled in him that hadn't been settled before. Not peace, not quite. He didn't think he was built for the uncomplicated version of peace, and he'd made a functional arrangement with that fact over the years. But something had eased, some chronic background tension that he'd carried so long he'd stopped registering it as tension. Sophie was exactly where his mother-in-law had described, curled on the couch with a throw blanket and a small smile that might have been a dream or might have been residual gelato satisfaction. The empty bowl was on the coffee table. Ethan picked it up and took it to the kitchen and washed it without turning on the overhead light, moving quietly in the way you move when there's a sleeping child in the next room and you're protecting something that doesn't need protecting, but you do it anyway. He sat on the edge of the couch beside her. She didn't wake up. Her hair was in 2 uneven braids that she'd done herself because she'd decided at the start of 3rd grade that she was old enough to do her own hair, which was technically true if you adjusted your definition of even. He reached up and pulled the dog tags out from his collar and held them in his hand in the dark. The familiar weight, the worn chain. Daniel Monroe's name pressed into metal that had been pressed against Daniel Monroe's chest, and then pressed into Ethan's hand, and then worn against Ethan's chest for 6 years, because he hadn't known what else to do with them, except keep them close until he figured out the right thing. He'd figured out the right thing. Sophie made a small sound in her sleep and shifted, and her hand landed near his knee in the unconscious and trusting way that children reach toward the people they're certain of, and Ethan sat in the dark kitchen light of his apartment and held Daniel Monroe's dog tags and felt the specific weight of something finally, actually done. He was still sitting there when Celeste Monroe's name appeared on the front page of 3 different news websites the following morning, adjacent to photographs taken by the journalists in the Harrington Grand lobby. Photographs that showed her walking out of the gala with what every caption described as an unidentified individual, visible a few steps behind her. By 9 a.m., the speculation had started. By noon, the story had enough traction that Patricia, the event coordinator, had called 3 separate journalists to provide what she described as context, which in practice meant her version of what she'd observed from across the ballroom. By 2 in the afternoon, a low-resolution image someone had taken on their phone during the confrontation near the refreshment table. Celeste's face, Ethan's stillness, the crowd angling in, the dog tags visible at his collar, had been shared enough times to constitute a viral moment, though no one yet knew what the moment actually contained. Marcus called Celeste at 8:45. She was already at her desk. "You've seen it," he said, obviously. "Do you want to put out a statement?" She was quiet for a moment. On her desk, next to her coffee and the 3 open documents she'd been working through since 6:30, was Ethan's empty water glass from the conference room table. She'd carried it out without thinking about it at the end of the night, some unconscious impulse toward keeping something tangible from the evening, and hadn't noticed until she was in the car. "Not yet," she said. "Celeste?" "Marcus, I said not yet." She paused. "When the time comes, I'll know what to say. Right now I need 2 more days before I say anything publicly." 2 days is a long time in the current media cycle. "I know what 2 days is." She picked up her coffee, set it back down. "Get me the legal team's availability for Thursday, and tell communications to hold any press inquiries until I've briefed them personally." She paused. "And Marcus?" "Yeah. Run a full background on Ethan Walker. Not because I think he's lying, because I want to know his financial situation." A short pause on Marcus's end. "That's a specific thing to want to know." "Yes," she agreed. "It is." She hung up and looked at the window. Outside, her city was doing its ordinary Tuesday thing. Traffic accumulating on the avenue below, delivery trucks double parked with their hazards on. The specific choreography of a city going about its business, in full ignorance of the private, enormous things happening inside its buildings. She thought about Daniel saying her name in a room she would never see, in a moment she had not been present for, to a man she'd met for the first time the night before. She thought about what it meant that his last specific, deliberate act had been to ensure that she would eventually know she hadn't been lied to, that everything she'd believed about the man she'd married had been accurate. The love, the commitment, the specific quality of his character under pressure. She'd spent 6 years with the facts, but without the story. Now she had both. She opened her laptop and pulled up a blank document and sat for a moment looking at the cursor blinking in the empty space. Then she typed 3 words at the top: Daniel Monroe Foundation. And underneath that, a single line: Children of Fallen Service Members, Scholarships, Support, Continuity of Opportunity. And underneath that, because it was the first thing that came to mind clearly, Ethan Walker, Board. She looked at what she'd written. The cursor blinked. Then she picked up her phone and sent a text to the number on the cream-colored card she'd given him. No, she realized immediately, she'd given him the card, she didn't have his number. She'd have to wait for him to call. Which, she thought, was probably fine. Some things were worth waiting for. She'd had enough practice. He called on Wednesday. Not because she'd said she would call if she didn't hear from him by Wednesday, though she had said that and he remembered it, but because Sophie had asked him at breakfast why he seemed different, and he hadn't known how to answer an 8-year-old's version of that question. And the not knowing had made him realize that some things needed to be moved forward rather than waited on. "You seem like when you finished fixing Mr. Kowalski's boat engine," Sophie said, over cereal, "like something stopped being broken." He'd looked at her across the kitchen table, at her uneven braids and her serious expression and the way she held her spoon like a person with opinions, and thought that Daniel had been right about a lot of things, but the nose observation was the least of it. "I talked to someone last night," he said. "Someone I needed to talk to for a long time." Sophie considered this with the gravity of a person who understood that adult conversations sometimes carried weight that didn't get fully explained. "Did it help?" "Yeah," he said. I think it did. She nodded, satisfied, and returned to her cereal, and Ethan sat across from her in the morning light of their small kitchen and felt the specific gratitude of a man who understands that the life he has, imperfect, undersized by certain measures, held together with routine and stubbornness, and the particular love of a single parent who is making it up as he goes, is not a lesser version of something better. It is the actual thing. He called Celeste at 9:15 after dropping Sophie at school and driving to the marina where he worked. He was sitting in his truck in the parking lot with the engine off and the windows down, and the smell of salt water and marine fuel came through in equal measure, which was the smell of most of his mornings and which he had long since stopped noticing. She picked up on the second ring. "Walker," she said. Not hello, just his name in the tone of someone who had been expecting the call and was glad it came. "I said I'd call," he said. "You did." A pause. Not uncomfortable, just a breath of transition. "How's Sophie?" "Perceptive," he said. "She told me I seemed like a fixed boat engine." A short, genuine laugh from her end. Not the polished social laugh from the gala. This one was smaller and more actual. That might be the most accurate thing anyone said about last night. She has that quality. He leaned back in his seat. "You wanted to talk about the foundation." "I do, but not on the phone. There's too much to cover, and I want to be able to read your face when I say some of it, because I'm going to ask you things that might be uncomfortable, and I'd rather do that in person." A brief pause. "Can you do Thursday? I can come to you, if that's easier with Sophie's schedule." He blinked. Celeste Monroe, billionaire, CEO, offering to come to him. He thought about his office. A marina break room with a coffee maker that worked 60% of the time and a whiteboard covered in engine diagrams. "I can come to you," he said. "That makes more sense." "Okay, 2:00. I'll send the address." "All right." Another pause, and then she said something he wasn't expecting. "Did you sleep?" "Some," he said honestly. "You?" "Not much." She said it without complaint, just as information. "I kept thinking about what you said, about Daniel's hand not being steady." A quiet beat. "I needed that detail. I didn't know I needed it until you told me, but it mattered. It made him real again in a way I hadn't let myself access." She stopped. "I'm not sure I'm explaining that correctly." "You are," he said. "You're explaining it exactly right. The Thursday meeting happened in a conference room on the 31st floor of Vertex Systems headquarters, which was everything the Harrington Grand's conference room had not been. Glass walls, a view of the city that cost more than Ethan's annual income just by existing, furniture that had been selected by someone with a philosophy about furniture. There was real coffee. There were 4 people from Celeste's legal and philanthropic team, arranged along one side of the table with toilettes and folders, and the particular readiness of professionals who had been briefed thoroughly and were prepared to execute. Ethan sat across from them in a jacket that was actually his own this time, which fit correctly in the shoulders, and felt the faint absurdity of the room in proportion to the thing being discussed. Celeste sat at the head of the table and ran the meeting with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned to respect other people's time by having her own relentlessly not respected. She outlined what she had been building in the 3 days since the gala. The structure of the Daniel Monroe Memorial Foundation, its initial endowment, its 3-part mandate, educational scholarships for children of fallen service members, mental health support for military families navigating loss, and a mentorship pipeline connecting veteran communities with employment opportunities in the private sector. She presented it like the business proposal. It partly was clean, structured, evidence-based, and then she stopped and looked at Ethan and said, "Tell me what's wrong with it." The legal team shifted slightly. "Nothing's wrong with it," Ethan said. "It's well designed and you've clearly thought about it seriously." He paused. "But the mental health component is going to be harder than you've built it to be. The families who need it most are also the families most resistant to accessing it, and that resistance is structural, not personal. It's not that they don't want help, it's that the way help is usually offered doesn't match the way those communities actually function." Celeste leaned forward slightly. "Explain that." People in military families, especially in smaller communities, don't respond well to institutional models. Hotlines, referral services, formal intake processes, those work for some people and they're a dead end for others. What works better is lateral support. Someone who's been through it, talking to someone who's currently in it. Not therapy, not officially, just a conversation between people who share the specific weight. He paused. The mentorship pipeline you've got in the third component, that model, that peer-to-peer structure, that should be the delivery mechanism for the mental health support too. Not a replacement for clinical resources, but the front door. Celeste looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the woman to her left, her foundation director, a composed woman named Adayeze, who had been writing steadily since Ethan started talking. Did you get that? All of it, Adayeze said, without looking up. Good. Celeste looked back at Ethan. What else? They went for 2.5 hours. Ethan had not expected to be useful for 2.5 hours. He'd expected to answer a few questions from his specific vantage point and then sit politely while the professionals handled the rest. But Celeste kept asking him things, and the things she asked him were not the questions you asked someone when you wanted them to feel included. They were the questions you asked someone when you actually needed what they knew. By the end, the Foundation's mental health framework had been substantially restructured. The scholarship criteria had been adjusted to include a provision Ethan mentioned almost as an aside, that children of service members who went missing in action or whose deaths were classified should receive the same access as those with official confirmed casualty status, because the bureaucratic ambiguity of those situations often meant the families fell through every available gap. Celeste had stopped the meeting entirely when he said that. That's not in the current mandate. No, he said, but it should be. She looked at Adayeze. Adayeze was already typing. When the legal team finally packed up and filed out with the particular efficiency of people who had a lot of work ahead of them, Celeste and Ethan were left at the table with the remains of the coffee and the view of the city doing its indifferent afternoon thing outside the glass. I want you to lead this, she said. He'd been expecting it. She'd been building toward it for the last hour, the way the conversation had been orienting him toward the center of the thing, rather than its periphery. But hearing it directly was different from anticipating it. I'm a marine mechanic, he said. You're also someone who spent a decade operating in high-stakes environments that required rapid assessment and execution with incomplete information, who's been raising a child alone for 4 years while maintaining stable employment and community relationships, and who just spent 2 hours identifying structural flaws in a philanthropic framework that my team spent 3 weeks building. She looked at him evenly. I don't need someone who knows how to run a nonprofit. I need someone who understands what this is for. Those are different qualifications, and yours are better. I don't have a college degree. I don't care. The board might. I pick the board. He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them blinked in the particular way of two people who have each, in their separate lives, learned not to be the first one to look away from something difficult. I have a daughter who needs consistency, he said. I can't be traveling constantly, attending events in borrowed suits, operating in a world that's very far from where we actually live. The Foundation's operational center will be regional, not New York-based. You'd need to be available for quarterly board meetings and one annual event. Everything else is manageable remotely and on your schedule. She paused. The borrowed suit problem is yours to solve. I have no opinion on your wardrobe. The corner of his mouth moved. That's surprisingly restrained of you. I have many surprising qualities. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the city through the glass. He thought about Sophie, who took people seriously and had her father's nose and walked into school without looking back. He thought about the children the Foundation would reach, kids who had grown up in the specific atmosphere of a home where someone important was missing, where the flag on the mantle meant something that other kids' flags didn't, where the adults around them were carrying weight that sometimes made them unavailable in ways that nobody chose and everybody felt. He thought about Daniel Monroe pressing dog tags into his hand and saying, take care of the civilians and get home to your kid, and whether doing this counted as the former, and whether saying yes counted as fully completing the latter. He thought it probably counted as both. Okay, he said. Celeste nodded once, not triumphantly. She wasn't a person who did triumph in small rooms, just a single nod of acknowledgement. The nod of someone checking an important box. I'll have the formal offer from legal by end of week. Read it carefully and push back on anything that doesn't work. I will. And Walker, she held his gaze. This isn't charity. I want to be clear about that. I'm not doing this because I feel I owe you something for what you did with the tags, or for what you carried, or for that night at the gala. I'm doing it because you're the right person, and this is the right thing, and those two facts don't need a sentimental explanation. I know, he said. I wouldn't have said yes if it felt like charity. Good. He stood. She stood. They shook hands again, the same slightly formal gesture as the gala, carrying the same acknowledgement of scale, and then he picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and headed toward the door. How's Wednesday looking? She called after him. For a site visit to the first regional partner we're considering. It's a veterans community center in Bridgeport. I want your read on the facility and the people running it. He stopped at the door. Sophie has soccer on Wednesday afternoons. Thursday then. Thursday works. He took the elevator down 31 floors and walked out onto the street and stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the full afternoon light, with the city moving around him in all directions, and he felt not happy, exactly, because happy was a thin word for something this dimensional. He felt purposeful, which was different and in some ways better, because purpose was something you could build a life around in a way that happiness, which came and went on its own schedule, could not always be. He had a meeting next Thursday. He had a foundation to help build. He had a daughter with uneven braids who compared him to a fixed boat engine and meant it as the highest compliment. He started walking toward the parking garage. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in October, the Daniel Monroe Memorial Foundation was publicly announced. The press release went out at 8 a.m. and Celeste's communications team handled the volume of media response with professional efficiency. By noon, the story had been picked up by 4 national outlets. By evening, it was being discussed on 2 cable news programs, primarily because the backstory had leaked. Not from anyone on Celeste's team, but from one of the guests at the Whitmore Legacy Gala who had witnessed the confrontation near the refreshment table and had finally stopped sitting on what they knew. The narrative that emerged in the media was not entirely accurate, because narratives rarely are. It was compressed and slightly dramatized and missing several of the most important details. But it was close enough to the truth that the people who needed to understand it could. Ethan saw the coverage on his phone while he was eating lunch in the marina break room. He read the main article twice, identified the 3 places where it got things wrong, decided none of them were wrong enough to matter, and put his phone in his pocket and went back to work. That afternoon, Sophie came home from school with a form that needed to be signed for an upcoming field trip, and while Ethan was reading it, she said, "Dad, is it true you were on the news?" He looked up. "Who told you that?" "Caleb's mom. She showed Caleb, and Caleb told me." She fixed him with the particular look she had, the one that meant she was processing something seriously. "Were you?" "Kind of. It's complicated." "Can you explain the complicated part?" He thought about how to do that, about what version of it was the right size for an 8-year-old, what was appropriate to share, and what was too heavy, and he landed on what he usually landed on, which was the truth in its simplest form. "I made a promise to someone a long time ago," he said, "and last week I finished keeping it, and people found out about it." Sophie considered this. "Was it hard? Keeping it?" "Yeah, for a while. But you did it anyway." "Yeah." She nodded with the gravity of someone filing this information under things that confirm existing beliefs. "Okay," she said. "Can you sign the field trip form? It's due tomorrow." He signed the form. But later, after dinner, after Sophie was in bed and the apartment had settled into its nighttime quiet, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone slightly cold and thought about the promise and what it had cost and what it had given back. And he arrived, not for the first time, but more clearly than before, at something he'd been circling for 6 years. He had thought, for a long time, that the promise was the dog tags, that Daniel had handed him a physical object and a set of words, and that completing the mission meant delivering both. And that was true, as far as it went. But sitting in the quiet kitchen, he understood that the promise had never been only about the dog tags. The promise was larger and less specific than that. It was the promise that the sacrifice would mean something forward, that the weight of what happened that night would become something other than just loss, that the people left behind would be given not only the truth, but something to do with it. Celeste was building that. He was helping build it. The children who would receive scholarships in Daniel Monroe's name, who would go to college or trade school or wherever they were trying to get, funded in part by the specific grief of a woman who had turned 6 years of unanswered sorrow into something with a structure and a purpose. Those children would carry something forward too, without knowing its origin, without needing to know. That was how it worked. That was how any of it worked, if it worked at all. The loss doesn't disappear. It transforms. Not into something better, not into something that makes the original loss acceptable or fair or worth it. Nothing makes it worth it, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling a version of the story that leaves out the hard parts. But it can transform into something that does work in the world, something that has weight and direction and the specific gravity of people who have decided not to let the worst thing that happened to them be the last thing that defines them. Celeste had decided that. Ethan had, in his quieter way, decided it too. The marine mechanic life, the single father life, the getting Sophie to soccer on. Wednesday's life, all of it a version of the same decision made in smaller increments over 4 years of loss piled on top of loss. The dog tags were still around his neck. He wore them every day, the same as he had since November 6 years ago, and he would probably keep wearing them for the same reason he had always worn them. Not as a reminder of what was lost, because he didn't need a reminder for that, but as a reminder of what had been entrusted to him and what he had done with it. He finished the cold coffee, rinsed the cup, turned off the kitchen light. In the morning, Sophie would need her hair braided before school, and she would have opinions about breakfast, and somewhere in the back of the car, there was a library book 3 days overdue that he kept forgetting to bring in, and the marina had a 40-foot sailboat coming in Thursday morning with what the owner described as a complicated situation with the engine, which Ethan had learned to translate as expensive and time-consuming but ultimately fixable. The ordinary machinery of a life, small and actual and his. He walked down the hall and stopped at Sophie's door and looked in at her sleeping, at her uneven braids spread across the pillow, at the drawing she'd made that afternoon taped to the wall beside her bed, a picture of a boat with 2 figures on it, labeled in her handwriting Dad and me. The proportions entirely wrong, and the water an implausible shade of purple. He stood there for a moment. Some things are not fixable. Some losses are permanent, and the people left behind are changed in ways that don't unchange. And no foundation or scholarship or promise delivered years late fully repairs what the original loss broke. Ethan knew that. Celeste knew it better. Grief doesn't end. It just gradually stops being the loudest thing in the room. But the picture on the wall was real. The uneven braids were real. The cold coffee and the overdue library book and the complicated sailboat engine and the Thursday site visit to Bridgeport and the foundation that would carry a dead man's name into the futures of children who never knew him. All of it was real, and all of it was forward, and forward was the only direction that led anywhere worth going. He pulled Sophie's door most of the way closed and went to bed. Outside, the city did what cities do, constant, indifferent, alive. And somewhere across it, in a penthouse apartment that cost more than most people's entire lives, Celeste Monroe was at her desk at 11:30 at night because she was constitutionally incapable of stopping before midnight, working on the framework document for the Foundation's first grant cycle. She stopped at one point and looked at the window. Daniel, she thought, not as a prayer, not as a plea, just his name, the way you think the name of someone who has been present in your day in invisible ways. In the decisions you made and the words you chose and the particular shape of the work you were doing and why. She let the thought sit for a moment. Then she went back to work. Not because she had to prove something, not because stopping felt dangerous or the silence felt too large, or the work was a wall she was building against something she didn't want to feel, just because it mattered. Because she was someone who did things that mattered. And this was one of them, and there was still an hour of good work left in the evening. She worked until midnight. Then she closed the laptop and went to bed. Some promises take years to deliver. Some truths take longer than they should to reach the people who need them. Some losses carve out spaces that never fully fill. But the spaces don't have to stay empty. They can become the exact shape that something new and necessary fits into, the way water finds the specific geography of the land it moves through, not forced, not pretending to be something other than what it is, just finding its way slowly and without ceremony, toward something that sustains. That was the legacy. Not the foundation, not the scholarships, not the press release, or the cable news coverage, or the photograph that had briefly gone viral of a woman in a navy dress standing near a man in an ill-fitting suit. The legacy was the decision, made independently by two people who had never met. In the years following a loss, neither of them chose. The decision to keep moving, to keep building, to stay present for the small, ordinary things that accumulate over time into a life. Daniel Monroe had understood something about that in the last hours of his. He'd bet everything on the people he was leaving behind understanding it too. He hadn't been wrong.